The snow fell silently over the mountains of the Appalachian Range, blanketing the winding road with a treacherous white veil. Anthony Miller, a 55-year-old successful businessman, drove his Land Rover cautiously, his thoughts as foggy as the landscape ahead. The dashboard clock read 11:45 p.m., and the night silence was broken only by the soft purr of the engine and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. Loneliness had been his constant companion in recent years. Since taking over the family business after his father's sudden departure, Anthony had thrown himself into work, transforming the small family company into an empire. But success tasted bitter, as it couldn't erase the memory of Eliza, his younger sister, who had mysteriously disappeared when he was just 15. As he navigated another sharp curve, something unusual caught his attention. The headlights illuminated a large, dark shape lying by the roadside. Anthony slowed down, hesitant. His rational mind told him to keep driving. Stopping on a deserted road in the middle of the night wasn't wise, but something stronger, perhaps the same intuition that had guided him in business, made him stop. He stepped out of the car, feeling the icy wind cut through his face. There, trembling in the snow, was a majestic black horse. The animal had an elegant stature, even in its vulnerable state. But what struck Anthony most were its eyes, deep, almost human, conveying a silent plea that instantly transported him back to his childhood memories. "I can't leave him here," he murmured to himself, remembering Eliza's love for horses. His sister had spent hours in the stables at the farm, talking to the animals as if they were old friends. With considerable effort and careful maneuvering, he managed to coax the horse to its feet and led it to his truck. The Miller family farm was just a few miles away. It was an old property, passed down through generations, but one Anthony rarely visited. He kept staff to maintain the place, preferring the convenience of his city apartment. Yet that night, something had compelled him to make this unexpected trip. Upon arriving at the farm, Anthony led the animal to the stable, which was surprisingly well kept. The familiar scent of hay and wood brought a wave of memories. Eliza running between the stalls, his father overseeing the workers, his mother bringing hot coffee on winter mornings. After settling the horse with fresh water and hay, Anthony watched it for a few minutes. There was something familiar about it, something he couldn't quite place. Before retreating to the main house, he covered it with a thick blanket and made sure it was comfortable. That night, his dreams were filled with fragmented images of the past. Children's laughter echoing through the farm corridors, the sound of hooves in the snow, and Eliza's voice calling his name from afar. He woke several times, restless, with the feeling that something important was about to happen. The next morning, as the first rays of sunlight pierced the fog, Anthony headed to the stable, eager to check on his unexpected guest. But as he opened the heavy wooden doors, he was met with silence. The stable was empty. There were no tracks in the snow outside, no signs that the doors had been opened during the night. For a moment, Anthony wondered if it had all been a vivid dream, a product of his tired mind. But then, his eyes landed on something on the floor of the stall where he had left the horse, a piece of aged yellowed fabric with an embroidered symbol that made his heart race. That symbol. He knew it from somewhere, but where? As he held the fabric between his fingers, a cold gust of wind swept through the stable, carrying with it the distant echo of a neigh. Anthony looked out through the open door, where the mountains stood tall against the morning sky. Something told him that the encounter in the snow hadn't been a coincidence, and that his life was about to change forever. Intrigued by the symbol on the piece of fabric found in the stable, Anthony decided to search his father's old office at the farm. The room had remained virtually untouched since the family moved to the city, preserving decades of history in its dusty shelves and locked drawers. As he sifted through yellowed documents, a particularly old folder caught his eye. Inside, he found records of the family's properties in the region, including mentions of a place called Cold Stone Village. The name stirred something in his memory, vague recollections of whispered conversations between his parents, always cut short when he or Eliza approached. Determined to investigate, Anthony began questioning the farm's older staff about the village. Most avoided eye contact and changed the subject, but old Joe, the foreman who had worked there for over 4 decades, finally relented after much insistence. "Cold Stone Village isn't a place for outsiders, Mr. Anthony," the old man said, nervously adjusting his worn hat. "They say that place holds secrets best left alone. Your mother always said there was something special about that village, something that needed protecting. The mention of his mother piqued his curiosity even more. Helen Miller had always been a mysterious woman, carrying secrets she took with her when she left on a long journey, from which she never returned. Anthony remembered how she used to wear a peculiar brooch, which disappeared around the same time Eliza did. Determined to learn more, he decided to visit the village. Following old Joe's vague directions, he drove along increasingly narrow and winding roads, venturing into a part of the mountains where cell service didn't reach. The dense fog seemed to envelop everything, creating shadows that danced among the ancient trees. After 2 hours of driving, he spotted the first stone houses that characterized the village. The place seemed frozen in time, with its old buildings and cobblestone streets. The few villagers visible on the streets hurried into their homes as his car passed, as if his presence were a threat. He parked near what appeared to be the central square, where an old stone church stood imposingly. As he stepped out of the car, he felt the weight of suspicious gazes from half-closed windows. The silence was unsettling, broken only by the distant sound of bells. An elderly woman sweeping the entrance of her home caught his attention. Unlike the other villagers, she watched him with a look of recognition, as if she had been expecting his arrival. It was Mrs. Marlowe, though Anthony didn't yet know her name. Her eyes, deep and wise, reminded him inexplicably of the mysterious horse's eyes. "You're Helen's son," she said, not as a question but as a statement. "I've been waiting for the day you'd find your way here. Some secrets have their own time to be revealed." Before Anthony could respond, a group of men began approaching the square, their faces filled with concern and hostility. Mrs. Marlowe quickly made a discreet gesture, indicating he should leave. "Come back when the moon is full," she whispered, turning to enter her house. "There's much you need to know, but not now, not like this." Reluctantly, but sensing the growing tension, Anthony returned to his car. As he drove away, he noticed in the rearview mirror that the men remained in the square, watching him leave. On the passenger seat, the piece of fabric with the mysterious symbol seemed to pulse with its own energy. Back at the farm, Anthony decided to explore Eliza's old room, which had remained untouched since her disappearance. The dust on the furniture told the story of years of absence, but something in the air suggested that the space held more than just memories. As night fell over the mountains, a distant neigh echoed through the valley. On the farm's porch, Anthony gazed at the faint lights of Cold Stone Village, glowing like fireflies on the dark horizon. Something told him that the mysteries of that village and his sister's disappearance were connected in ways he didn't yet understand. The full moon finally arrived, bathing the mountains in its silvery light. Anthony, following Mrs. Marlowe's mysterious guidance, returned to Cold Stone Village. This time he chose a more discreet route, parking his car at the village's edge and walking through the shadows of the ancient stone buildings. Mrs. Marlowe's house stood apart from the others, near a small grove of pine trees. A faint light flickered through lace curtains like a solitary beacon in the darkness. Before he could knock, she was already there, as if she had anticipated his arrival. "Come in quickly," the old woman whispered, her eyes scanning the darkness around them. "The village walls have ears, and not everyone is ready for the truths that need to be revealed." The interior of the house was a sanctuary of memories. Old photographs covered the walls, and dried herbs hung from the ceiling, filling the air with their peculiar scent. On a dark wooden table, a familiar cameo brooch caught Anthony's attention, identical to the one his mother used to wear. "You recognize it, don't you?" Mrs. Marlowe asked, noticing his gaze. "Helen and I were more than just acquaintances. We're part of a very old story, one your sister Eliza also came to share." The revelation made Anthony sit down, his legs suddenly weak. "You knew my sister? Do you know what happened to her?" Mrs. Marlowe sighed deeply, pouring herbal tea into antique porcelain cups. "Eliza didn't disappear, Anthony. She was chosen just as your mother was before her, just as I was in my youth. We are the guardians, protectors of something far older and more powerful than you can imagine." The sound of hooves in the garden interrupted their conversation. Through the window, Anthony glimpsed the silhouette of the same black horse he had found on the road. The animal seemed to watch him with those deep, knowing eyes before disappearing into the darkness once more. "The messenger," Mrs. Marlowe murmured, an enigmatic smile on her lips. "He chooses those who are ready to know the truth. He guided Eliza to us, and now he's guiding you." The old woman rose with surprising agility, heading to an ancient chest in the corner of the room. From it, she retrieved a leather-bound book, its pages yellowed with age. As she opened it, Anthony recognized his sister's delicate handwriting. "This is Eliza's diary," Mrs. Marlowe explained. "She recorded everything here, her journey, her discoveries, the secrets she swore to protect. But you can only read it when you're truly ready." A noise from the village caught their attention. Lights began to turn on in the houses and raised voices echoed through the cobblestone streets. "They know you're here, Mrs. Marlowe said, urgency in her voice. "The village council doesn't approve of my decision to share our secrets. You need to leave, but take this with you." She handed Anthony an ancient medallion, identical to the symbol on the fabric from the stable. "When the time comes, this will guide you to where it all began. But remember, some truths can only be revealed at the right time, and some choices once made cannot be undone." Anthony left Mrs. Marlowe's house through the back door, just as angry voices approached from the main street. As he slipped into the darkness, his hands clutched the medallion tightly, feeling its weight not just physically but also the weight of the secrets it carried. On the way back to the farm, the full moon illuminated his path like a natural spotlight. The distant neigh of the mysterious black horse echoed through the mountains, a promise that more revelations were yet to come. In his mind, Mrs. Marlowe's words mingled with memories of his childhood, creating a mosaic of questions demanding answers. Back at the farm, Anthony couldn't take his eyes off the medallion Mrs. Marlowe had given him. The object seemed to pulse with its own energy under the light of his desk lamp. His fingers traced the contours of the engraved symbol, identical to the one on the piece of fabric from the stable, as his mind tried to process the revelations of that night. Morning found him still awake, surrounded by old family photographs he had discovered in a forgotten box. In one, his mother Helen wore a medallion similar to the one now in his hands. In another, older photo, Eliza appeared smiling beside a black horse, strikingly similar to the one he had found on the road. A sound from the barn interrupted his thoughts. Upon arriving, he found Peter, a boy of about 12 whom he had never seen before, feeding the mysterious horse that had inexplicably returned. "You must be Miss Eliza's brother," the boy said matter-of-factly, as if it were completely normal to be there. "She asked me to give you this." Peter extended his hand, revealing an ornate old key. Anthony, stunned, barely had time to process the information before the boy continued. "Miss Eliza said you'd need it to open the special door. It appears sometimes, you know. Not to everyone. Only to those with the gift of seeing." "Wait, you've seen my sister? When? Where?" Anthony asked, his heart racing at the possibility of finally having concrete news. "In the caves," Peter replied, stroking the horse's neck. "She takes care of important things down there with the other guardians. But I can't say much, or the adults in the village will get mad at me." The horse neighed softly, as if agreeing with the boy's words. Peter smiled, sharing some silent understanding with the animal. "The messenger likes you," the boy commented. "He only appears to those with something special in their hearts. He's the one who first led me to Miss Eliza." Before Anthony could ask more questions, a distant call echoed through the valley. "That's my grandmother," Peter said, already heading for the barn door. "She doesn't know I come here. Please don't tell anyone you saw me." Alone again, Anthony examined the key in his hands. It was old, with intricate details that seemed to tell a story of their own. The horse approached, gently nuzzling his shoulder before departing once more, disappearing into the morning mist. Determined to understand more about the unfolding mysteries, Anthony returned to the office and began studying old maps of the region. On one, yellowed and fragile, he found markings indicating the existence of a complex cave system beneath Coldstone Village. As he examined the documents, a photograph fell from between the pages. In it, a group of people wearing medallions identical to his stood gathered in front of a cave entrance. Among them, he recognized his mother, much younger, beside Mrs. Marlowe. The date on the back indicated the photo had been taken just a week before Eliza's disappearance. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made him quickly stash the documents. Old Joe, the foreman, appeared at the door with a worried expression. "Boss, there's a group of men from Coldstone Village wanting to talk to you. They're saying it's about your family's property on their land." Anthony pocketed the medallion and the key, sensing he was about to face another chapter of this mysterious story that seemed to involve his entire family. As he prepared to meet the visitors, he couldn't help but notice that the clouds over the village had formed a pattern curiously similar to the medallion's symbol. The arrival of the men from Coldstone Village brought a heavy atmosphere to the Miller farm. There were 5 in total, led by Augustus Mendonza, a grey-haired man with a stern gaze who introduced himself as the village council's president. "Mr. Miller," Augustus began, his voice carrying an authority that seemed to come from centuries of tradition. "We've come to discuss your recent interference in matters that don't concern you. Coldstone Village has its own laws, its own traditions." Anthony received them in the farmhouse's main room, where portraits of his ancestors seemed to watch the scene with interest. The medallion in his pocket seemed to grow warm, as if reacting to the men's presence. "With all due respect," Anthony replied, keeping his calm, "the village's matters have concerned my family for generations. I have documents proving that part of the land belongs to the Millers." "Documents are just papers," interjected another man, younger and more impatient. "What matters are the traditions, the oaths made." "Oaths like the ones my sister Eliza made?" Anthony questioned, watching their reactions closely. The sudden silence and exchanged glances confirmed his suspicions. Augustus approached the window, observing the landscape for a few moments before turning back to Anthony. "Your sister made a choice, Mr. Miller. A choice that must be respected." "A choice no one bothered to explain to her family," Anthony countered, his voice firm. "Years passed without a word, without an explanation." The discussion was interrupted by a powerful neigh from outside. The black horse stood near the window, its eyes fixed on the gathered group. The village men showed visible discomfort at its presence. "The messenger shouldn't be here," murmured one of them, the oldest of the group. "This isn't a good sign." "That's enough," declared Augustus, regaining his composure. "Mr. Miller, this is a formal warning. Stay away from the village. There are things in motion that are greater than your personal quest." As the men left, Anthony noticed that one of them, the youngest, had discreetly left a note on the table. The message was clear. "Not all of us agree with the silence. Look for Samuel at the blacksmith's house at nightfall." The rest of the day dragged on as Anthony pondered his options. At dusk, he decided to follow the clue left by the young council member. Before leaving, he returned to the barn, where he found a surprise. Tied to the black horse's mane was a ribbon with the same pattern as the piece of fabric found earlier. In Coldstone Village, the streets were nearly deserted when he arrived. The blacksmith's house stood in a narrow alley near the rocky slopes guarding the cave entrances. Samuel waited in the workshop, among ancient tools and the orange glow of the forge. "My father was the blacksmith before me," Samuel began, checking to ensure they were alone. "He made the special locks for the caves, the ones that only open with the ancient keys." Anthony instinctively touched the key in his pocket, the one Peter had given him. Samuel noticed the gesture and nodded. "So, you already have one," the blacksmith continued. "There's a cave entrance few know about behind the old chapel, but you need to be careful. The council has guards, especially since some of us started questioning the old ways." A noise from the street made them fall silent. For a moment, only the crackling of the forge broke the silence. Samuel took the opportunity to quickly sketch a map on a piece of paper. "The division in the village is growing," he whispered. "Some believe it's time for change, for more openness. Others would do anything to keep the secrets buried." Anthony pocketed the map and thanked him, but before he could leave, Samuel grabbed his arm. "Your sister isn't the only one. There are others who made the same choice. The question is, was it really their choice?" On the way home, Anthony couldn't stop thinking about the blacksmith's words. The black horse accompanied him at a distance, like a protective shadow to the village's edge. The lights from the houses seemed like watchful eyes, observing his every move, while the crescent moon cast restless shadows over the ancient stone buildings. After 3 days of carefully studying the map provided by Samuel, Anthony decided it was time to explore the caves. The old chapel mentioned by the blacksmith was located in a more isolated part of Coldstone Village, surrounded by a small cemetery covered in ivy and statues weathered by time. The night chosen for the expedition was especially dark, with dense clouds covering the moon. Anthony parked his car at a safe distance and approached the chapel cautiously. The place seemed abandoned, but he knew that appearances in the village could be deceiving. Following the map's instructions, he found a small side door, almost completely covered by vines. The old key Peter had given him fit perfectly into the lock, which turned without a sound as if it had been recently oiled. The chapel's interior was a small, austere space, with dusty wooden pews and stained glass windows that told stories he couldn't fully decipher. On the altar, he noticed symbols carved similar to the one on the medallion he carried. "I was expecting you to come today," a familiar voice broke the silence. Mrs. Marlowe emerged from the shadows like a guardian spirit. "The stars are aligned, and the messenger has been restless." "You knew I'd come through the chapel?" Anthony asked, surprised by her presence. "There are many things I know, my dear, including that we are not alone in our quest for change." She approached the altar and pressed a specific sequence of symbols. A soft click echoed through the space, and a secret passage revealed itself behind the altar. "The tunnels are ancient," Mrs. Marlowe explained, lighting a lantern. "Older than the village itself. Our ancestors discovered them and understood their true purpose. Eliza understood as well. As they descended a narrow stone staircase, Anthony noticed that the walls were covered with symbols similar to those on the medallion. Some seemed to tell a story, others appeared to be instructions or warnings. "The Brotherhood exists to protect something very special," Mrs. Marlowe continued, her voice echoing softly. "Something that lies deep within these caves, something that must be preserved at all costs." The sound of distant voices made them pause. Mrs. Marlowe quickly extinguished the lantern and pulled Anthony into a recess in the wall. Footsteps approached, accompanied by a heated discussion. "The council can no longer ignore the signs," said a voice Anthony recognized as Samuel's. "The messenger is appearing more frequently, and the young are beginning to have visions again." "Keep your voice down," replied another person. "If Augustus finds out we're meeting here..." The footsteps and voices faded away until silence returned. Mrs. Marlowe waited a few more moments before relighting the lantern. "The village is changing," she whispered. "The balance we've maintained for generations is unraveling. Some say it's time to reveal our secrets, others fear it will bring our ruin." They continued descending, reaching a larger chamber where several tunnels converged. At the center was a circular stone table with the same symbol as the medallion carved into its surface. "This is where your sister made her choice," Mrs. Marlowe revealed, running her hand over the carving. "And this is where your mother years before also chose her path." Before they could continue, a familiar neigh echoed through the tunnels. The black horse somehow had found its own way into the caves and now stood at the entrance of one of the tunnels as if waiting for them. "The messenger is calling us," Mrs. Marlowe said with a mysterious smile. "There's something he wants you to see, something that might help you better understand your family's choices." The horse began walking down the chosen tunnel, its hooves making a rhythmic sound against the stone floor. Anthony and Mrs. Marlowe followed, delving deeper into the mysteries guarded beneath Cold Stone Village. The tunnel the horse led them through spiraled downward, deeper into the earth's core. The walls, initially rocky and irregular, gradually gave way to worked surfaces with increasingly elaborate carvings and symbols. "These symbols," Mrs. Marlowe explained, her voice softly reverberating, "tell the story of the Guardians. Each generation adds its own mark, its own story. Look," she pointed to a series of particularly well-preserved carvings. "This is your mother Helen's mark." Anthony stopped to examine the indicated symbols. They were different from the others, more fluid, as if telling a story in motion. Beside them, he recognized patterns similar to those Eliza used to sketch in her notebook as a teenager. The messenger continued its steady path, its hooves now making no sound, as if floating above the stone floor. The light from Mrs. Marlowe's lantern created dancing shadows on the walls, bringing the ancient symbols to life. "Why did my mother never tell us about this place?" Anthony asked, his voice mixed with emotion and confusion. "The secret wasn't hers to share," Mrs. Marlowe replied. "Each guardian must find their own path here. It was so with Helen, it was so with Eliza, and now..." Her sentence was interrupted when they reached a large circular chamber. The ceiling was so high it disappeared into the darkness, and natural crystal pillars emitted a soft, bluish luminescence. At the center, an ancient fountain bubbled with crystal-clear water, and around it 12 stone chairs formed a perfect circle. The black horse positioned itself near the fountain, its eyes reflecting the light from the crystals. Mrs. Marlowe approached one of the chairs, running her hand over a specific carving. "This was your mother's seat in the circle," she said softly. "And that one," she pointed to another chair 3 positions ahead, "is where your sister sits during our meetings." Anthony felt his heart race. "So Eliza is really alive and well," Mrs. Marlowe completed. "But her mission keeps her away from the surface most of the time. The Guardians have responsibilities few would understand." A sound of flowing water caught their attention. The messenger had approached the fountain, and with a gentle movement of its head, indicated something in the water. Anthony approached and, looking into the crystal-clear depths, saw images forming like a moving reflection. "The fountain shows memories," Mrs. Marlowe explained, approaching. "Memories of those who have been part of the circle." In the water, Anthony saw his mother, much younger, participating in a ceremony in that very chamber. Then the image changed to Eliza, a teenager, discovering the caves for the first time, her eyes shining with the same wonder he felt now. "Your family has always had a special connection to this place," Mrs. Marlowe continued. "The Millers were among the first to understand the importance of what we guard here. But over time, some in the village began to fear that our secrets might be lost, or worse, fall into the wrong hands." The messenger neighed softly, and the images in the fountain changed again. Now they showed a tense meeting of the village council, where Augustus and other conservative members argued heatedly with a younger group. "The village is divided," Mrs. Marlowe said, her voice filled with concern. "Some, like Augustus, believe we must keep the ancient traditions intact, isolating ourselves more and more from the outside world. Others, like Samuel and some of the young Guardians, believe it's time to adapt our traditions to new times." A distant noise echoed through the tunnels, making the horse raise its head in alert. Mrs. Marlowe quickly extinguished her lantern. "Someone is approaching," she whispered. "We must go. There's more you need to see, but not tonight. The council has doubled their vigilance since they learned of your presence in the village." As they prepared to leave, Anthony noticed something glinting near the chair that belonged to Eliza. It was a delicate brooch, identical to the one his mother used to wear. As he picked it up, he felt a familiar energy, as if the object recognized his touch. The next morning, after the discovery of the Guardian's chamber, Anthony woke to the sound of raised voices outside the farm. A group of young people from Cold Stone Village had gathered at his gate, led by Samuel, the blacksmith, and accompanied by Peter, the boy who had given him the key. "We need your help, Mr. Miller," Samuel said as Anthony received them. "The situation in the village is becoming unsustainable. Augustus and the council are punishing anyone who questions the old traditions." The group entered the house, and Anthony noticed that some of them discreetly wore symbols similar to his medallion. Among them was Mary, a young teacher from the village who carried an ancient book in her arms. "This book belonged to my grandmother," Mary explained, placing the volume on the table. "She was also a guardian, like your sister Eliza. Here is recorded a part of the history the council tries to keep hidden." The yellowed pages revealed that the Brotherhood of the Guardians did not arise from isolation, as Augustus and the traditionalists preached, but from the union of different families who discovered something extraordinary in the caves. "They're the first Guardians," Mary continued, "believed that what they found in the caves should be protected, but not hidden from the world. They understood that isolation would eventually lead to stagnation." Peter, who had been quiet until then, approached the window and pointed to the horizon, where the black horse grazed peacefully. "The messenger appears more frequently now. Miss Eliza says it's a sign that things need to change." "Have you been speaking with my sister regularly?" Anthony asked, surprised. "She teaches me about the caves," Peter replied with a smile. "She says the young need to learn the ancient knowledge in a new way." Samuel stepped forward, his expression serious. "The council has called a meeting for tonight. They plan to vote on new rules that will make the village's isolation even stricter. Some of us plan to protest, but we need your presence there," Mary completed. "As a Miller, your voice carries weight. Besides, we've discovered something in the caves that you need to see before the meeting." The group led Anthony by a different path to the caves, through an entrance near the village's old mill. The tunnels here were narrower, but Mary guided them with the confidence of someone who knew every turn. They reached a smaller chamber than the Guardians, but equally impressive. On the walls, ancient frescoes depicted the village's and the Brotherhood's history, in detail Anthony had never seen before. "Look," Mary said, illuminating a specific section of the fresco. "This is the union ceremony, when the founding families came together to protect what they found. The Millers were among them, but not as isolationists. but as a bridge between the outside world and the secrets we guard. A familiar sound echoed through the chamber, the neigh of the messenger. The black horse had found its own way to them, bringing a new object tied to its mane, a ribbon with embroideries forming a kind of map. "It's a sign," Peter whispered, his eyes shining with excitement. "Miss Eliza always says the messenger appears when we're on the right path." As they examined the map embroidered on the ribbon, the sound of footsteps echoed through the tunnels. The group tensed, but it was Mrs. Marlowe who appeared, her face marked by concern. "The council meeting has been moved up," she announced. "Augustus has discovered our movement. They're gathering right now in the chapel." Anthony firmly held the medallion around his neck, feeling its weight and responsibility. The moment of choice had come, and like his mother and sister before him, he would need to decide what role he would play in the history of Coldstone Village. The old chapel was packed when Anthony and the group arrived. The heavy air carried decades of tradition and secrets. Augustus occupied the central chair of a semicircle of elders, his hard eyes fixed on the door as they entered. "So this is how it will be?" Augustus thundered, standing up. "An open rebellion against our traditions? And you, Marlowe, one of the oldest guardians leading this insurrection?" Mrs. Marlowe stepped forward with dignity to the center of the room. Her small stature did nothing to diminish her imposing presence. "It's not a rebellion, Augustus. It's an awakening. Traditions weren't made to imprison us, but to guide us." The chapel's stained glass windows filtered the twilight, creating colorful patterns that danced on the stone floor. Through them, Anthony could see the messenger standing like a black sentinel in the cemetery. "The signs are everywhere," Mrs. Marlowe continued, her voice echoing through the sacred space. "The messenger appears more frequently. The young have visions and the land itself seems restless. It's time for change." Samuel stepped forward, unrolling the ancient book Mary had shown. "We've found records, proof that our ancestors never intended this extreme isolation. The Guardians were meant to be a bridge, not a wall." "Nonsense," interrupted one of the older council members. "Isolation has protected us for generations. Without it, how will we keep our secrets?" It was then that a new voice joined the discussion, clear, firm, and unexpectedly familiar. Peter, the boy who seemed to know more than he let on, spoke with a maturity beyond his years. "Miss Eliza taught me that the secrets we guard are not ours to keep, but ours to protect and share with those ready to understand them." A murmur ran through the assembly. The mention of Eliza's name caused different reactions: surprise, reverence, and in some cases, clear unease. Anthony felt the medallion around his neck pulse stronger. Stepping forward to the center of the chapel, beside Mrs. Marlowe, he finally understood his role in this extraordinary story. "My family," he began, his voice firm, "the Millers, have always been connected to this place, to these secrets, not as guardians of isolation, but as bridges between two worlds. It was so with my mother, it is so with my sister, and now I understand that this is also my path." The sound of hooves echoed through the chapel floor. To everyone's astonishment, the messenger had entered the room, its hooves softly touching the stone floor. The magnificent black animal stopped beside Anthony, its deep eyes fixed on Augustus. "The messenger himself manifests," exclaimed Mary, her voice mixed with admiration and hope. "This hasn't happened since the Brotherhood's founding." Augustus for the first time seemed shaken. His gaze alternated between the horse and the ancestral symbols carved on the chapel walls, which seemed to glow with their own light under the setting sun. "There is a prophecy," Mrs. Marlowe said, her voice now soft but clear, "passed down through generations. It speaks of a time when the messenger would choose a guardian to renew the ancient bonds, someone who carries in their blood the history of the first guardians." The younger council members began to rise one by one, moving to the side where Anthony and the others stood. The division in the council was now physical and visible. "Times are changing, Augustus," Mrs. Marlowe continued. "The question is no longer whether we will allow change, but how we will guide it. And for that, we need the wisdom of both the old and the new guardians." The messenger neighed softly, and a sudden wind blew through the chapel, making the candles flicker. For a moment, everyone could see the symbols on the walls glow more intensely, as if responding to an ancient and powerful force. In the silence that followed the phenomenon in the chapel, Augustus remained motionless, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. The symbols on the walls still emitted a soft glow, like embers after a great fire. "The prophecy," he finally said, his voice more tired than authoritative, "hasn't been mentioned for generations. I thought it was just an old legend." Mrs. Marlowe approached one of the wall panels, her fingers delicately tracing the glowing symbols. "They're not legends, Augustus. They're promises made by our ancestors." Helen knew this. That's why she left on her journey. The mention of his mother made Anthony step closer. "What journey? What did my mother discover?" "Your mother," Mrs. Marlowe replied, "was the first to understand that the signs were returning." The messenger began appearing more frequently during her time as a guardian. She began a quest to find other sacred places, other communities guarding secrets similar to ours. Samuel opened the ancient book again, now to a different page. "Here is the record of Helen's departure. She didn't abandon her family, Mr. Miller. She was fulfilling a greater mission." The messenger moved through the chapel, stopping before each of the older council members. Its deep eyes seemed to assess something beyond human understanding. "The prophecy speaks of a time of reunion," Mrs. Marlowe continued, "when the guardians of different sacred places would reconnect, strengthening the protection of our secrets through unity, not isolation." Peter, who had been quietly observing everything, suddenly perked up. "That's why Miss Eliza travels so much. She's following in Miss Helen's footsteps, isn't she?" The revelation struck Anthony like lightning. Eliza's long absences, the occasional letters with postmarks from distant places, it all began to make sense. Mary approached with another document, this one more recent. "We found this in the caves. It's Eliza's notes about other places like our village, other brotherhoods protecting their own sacred secrets." The wind blew through the chapel again, stronger this time, making the pages of the ancient book flip on their own until they stopped at a specific illustration. An ancient map showing points connected by lines forming a familiar pattern. "The same symbol as the medallion," Anthony murmured, touching the object around his neck. "The Millers have always been the weavers of connections," Mrs. Marlowe explained. "While other families guarded the secrets, yours had the gift of finding the paths between them. It was so with your ancestors, with your mother, with Eliza, and now the cycle completes with you," a voice from the chapel entrance completed. Everyone turned, surprised. There, framed by the twilight, was a figure Anthony would recognize anywhere, even after so many years. Eliza Miller, his sister, had returned to Coldstone Village. The messenger immediately went to her, receiving an affectionate pat. Eliza smiled, her eyes meeting her brother's with decades of untold stories. "It's time, Augustus," she said, her voice carrying the same gentle authority as Helen's. "The signs our mother foresaw are manifesting. The world is changing, and our role must change with it." Time seemed to freeze as Anthony and Eliza finally met in the center of the chapel. Years of absence and unanswered questions hung between them like a dense fog, until Eliza took the first step and embraced her brother tightly. "Forgive me for the silence," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "There was so much I wanted to tell you, but every secret revealed before its time could have compromised everything our mother started." Augustus, who watched the scene with a transformed expression, finally spoke. "So it's true. Helen found the others?" Eliza nodded, gently releasing her brother but keeping a hand on his shoulder. "Yes, she did. There are 7 sacred places like our village, each guarding its part of the ancestral knowledge. Our mother established the first contacts, and I continued her work." Mary approached with reverence, carrying the ancient book. "The notes we found, do they speak of these places?" "Each symbol on the medallion," Eliza explained, touching the one Anthony wore, "represents one of these places. Coldstone Village is just one point in a much larger web of protection and wisdom. The other 6 are scattered across the world, each guarding its own piece of the ancient knowledge our ancestors swore to protect." Anthony's mind raced as he tried to process the enormity of what Eliza was revealing. The medallion around his neck felt heavier, as if it carried the weight of centuries of secrets. But why keep this hidden? Why not share this knowledge with the world? Eliza's expression softened, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and understanding. "Because not everyone is ready to understand, Anthony. The knowledge we protect is powerful, too powerful to fall into the wrong hands. Our ancestors believed that only those who prove themselves worthy, who show the capacity to protect and respect this wisdom, should be entrusted with it." Mrs. Marlowe stepped forward, her voice steady but filled with emotion. Your mother understood this better than anyone. She spent years traveling, seeking out the other sacred places, forging connections between them. She knew that one day, the time would come when these places would need to unite, not just to protect their secrets, but to ensure that the knowledge could be shared responsibly. The messenger, standing nearby, neighed softly, as if affirming her words. Its presence seemed to calm the tension in the room, and even Augustus, who had been silent since Eliza's arrival, looked less resistant. "Eliza," Anthony said, his voice trembling with a mix of hope and frustration, "why didn't you tell me any of this? All these years I thought you were gone. I thought I'd lost you." Eliza reached out and took his hand, her grip firm and reassuring. "I wanted to tell you, Anthony, more than anything, but our mother made me swear to keep the secret until the time was right. She believed that you would find your way to the truth when you were ready, and now here you are." The room fell silent as everyone absorbed Eliza's words. The younger members of the council, who had been hesitant before, now looked at Anthony with a newfound respect. Even Augustus seemed to be reconsidering his stance. "So what happens now?" Anthony asked, looking around the room. "If the time has come to unite the sacred places, what do we do?" Eliza smiled, a spark of determination in her eyes. "We begin by strengthening the bonds between the guardians here in Coldstone Village. The divisions that have grown over the years must be healed. Then we reach out to the other sacred places, just as our mother did. Together we can ensure that the knowledge we protect is used wisely for the good of all." Mrs. Marlowe nodded in agreement. "The messenger has been restless for a reason. It senses that the time for change is now. We must listen to its guidance." As if on cue, the black horse stepped forward, its hooves clicking softly against the stone floor. It stopped in front of Anthony and Eliza, its deep eyes locking with theirs. Then it turned and began to walk toward the chapel's entrance, pausing to look back as if waiting for them to follow. Eliza squeezed Anthony's hand. "The messenger is showing us the way. Are you ready to take this journey with me?" Anthony took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the medallion against his chest. He thought of his mother, of Eliza, of all the generations of Millers who had come before him. This was his legacy, his responsibility, and for the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose that had been missing from his life. "I'm ready," he said, his voice steady and resolute. The group followed the messenger out of the chapel and into the cool night air. The village, usually quiet at this hour, seemed to hum with an undercurrent of energy. Lights flickered in windows, and the faint sound of voices carried on the breeze, as if the entire village was awakening to the changes that were coming. The messenger led them to the edge of the village where the path to the caves began. The entrance, once hidden and forgotten, now seemed to glow with a soft, inviting light. Eliza turned to Anthony, her eyes filled with pride. "This is where it all begins," she said. "The caves hold more than just secrets. They hold the key to understanding who we are and what we're meant to do." As they descended into the caves, the air grew cooler, and the walls seemed to pulse with a faint, rhythmic energy. The symbols carved into the stone glowed softly, guiding their way. Anthony felt a strange sense of familiarity, as if he had walked this path before, in another life. Deep within the caves, they reached a chamber unlike any they had seen before. The walls were covered in intricate carvings, depicting scenes of unity and harmony between the 7 sacred places. At the center of the room stood a large stone table, its surface etched with the same symbol as Anthony's medallion. Eliza placed her hand on the table, and the symbols began to glow brighter, casting a warm light throughout the chamber. "This is the heart of the Guardians," she said. "It's where the knowledge of all 7 sacred places converges, and it's where we must begin our work." Anthony stepped forward, feeling the energy of the room envelop him. He placed his medallion on the table, and the symbols on its surface began to glow in unison with those on the stone. A soft hum filled the air, and for a moment it felt as if the entire cave was alive. Mrs. Marlowe, Samuel, Mary, and the others watched in awe as the light from the table spread outward, illuminating the carvings on the walls. The messenger stood at the edge of the chamber, its eyes glowing with the same light. "This is just the beginning," Eliza said, her voice filled with hope. "Together, we can ensure that the knowledge we protect is used to bring light to the world, not darkness." Anthony looked around the chamber, at the faces of the people who had become his allies, his family. He thought of the journey ahead, of the challenges they would face, and of the legacy they were building. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of belonging, of purpose. As the light from the heart of the Guardians filled the chamber, Anthony knew that his life would never be the same. He had found his sister, uncovered the truth about his family, and discovered a mission greater than he had ever imagined. And with the messenger as their guide, he was ready to face whatever lay ahead. The journey to unite the sacred places would be long and difficult, but Anthony knew that they were not alone. The wisdom of the past, the strength of the present, and the hope for the future were all with them. And as the light from the heart of the Guardians continued to shine, Anthony felt a sense of peace, knowing that they were on the right path. The messenger neighed softly, as if to signal that it was time to move forward. Eliza took Anthony's hand, and together they stepped into the light, ready to embrace their destiny as guardians of the ancient knowledge. The journey had only just begun, but Anthony knew that, with his sister by his side and the messenger as their guide, they would succeed in their mission to protect and share the wisdom of the ages. The light from the heart of the Guardians enveloped Anthony and Eliza as they stepped forward, their hands clasped tightly. The chamber seemed to hum with a quiet energy, as if the very stones were alive with the knowledge of centuries. The messenger stood at the edge of the light, its dark form contrasting sharply with the radiant glow, its eyes reflecting the ancient symbols that pulsed around them. As the light grew brighter, Anthony felt a strange sensation, as if the ground beneath him was shifting, though he remained firmly in place. The carvings on the walls began to move, their lines and symbols flowing like liquid, rearranging themselves into new patterns. He recognized some of the symbols from the medallion around his neck, but others were unfamiliar, their meanings hidden in the depths of time. Eliza squeezed his hand, her voice steady but filled with awe. "This is it, Anthony. The heart is awakening. It's showing us the way forward." The light coalesced into a beam that shot upward, piercing the ceiling of the chamber and disappearing into the darkness above. For a moment, the entire cave seemed to hold its breath. Then, the beam split into 7 distinct rays, each one branching out in a different direction. Anthony realized with a start that the rays were pointing to the locations of the other sacred places, the 7 points of the ancient network. Mrs. Marlowe stepped forward, her eyes wide with wonder. "The heart is guiding us. It's showing us the paths to the other sanctuaries. This is the moment we've been waiting for." The messenger neighed again, its voice echoing through the chamber. It turned and began to walk toward one of the branching rays of light, pausing to look back at Anthony and Eliza as if urging them to follow. Eliza nodded, her determination clear. "We need to follow the messenger. It will lead us to the first of the other sanctuaries, but we can't do this alone. We'll need the help of everyone here." Anthony turned to the group gathered in the chamber, Samuel, Mary, Peter, Mrs. Marlowe, and the others. Their faces were a mix of fear and excitement, but they all nodded in agreement. They had come this far together, and they were ready to see this through. "Then let's go," Anthony said, his voice firm. "We have a lot of work to do." The group followed the messenger out of the chamber and back through the winding tunnels of the caves. As they walked, Anthony couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, not by anything malevolent, but by the spirits of those who had come before them, the guardians who had protected these secrets for generations. When they emerged from the caves, the village of Coldstone Village was bathed in the soft light of dawn. The air was crisp and clear, and the mountains stood tall and silent in the distance. The messenger led them to the edge of the village, where the path to the first sanctuary began. Eliza turned to Anthony, her expression serious. "This is where we part ways, at least for now. The messenger will guide you to the first sanctuary. I'll stay here and begin preparing the village for what's to come. We need to ensure that Coldstone Village is ready to welcome the other guardians when they arrive." Anthony hesitated, the thought of leaving his sister again after just finding her filling him with unease. But he knew she was right. They each had their roles to play, and they couldn't afford to waste any time. "Be careful," he said, pulling her into a tight embrace. "I'll see you soon." Eliza smiled, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You too, brother. Trust the messenger. It won't lead you astray." With that, Anthony turned and followed the black horse as it began its journey down the mountain path. The rest of the group stayed behind, watching as he disappeared into the distance. The messenger moved with purpose, its hooves barely making a sound on the rocky trail. Anthony felt a strange sense of calm as he walked, as if the horse's presence was shielding him from doubt and fear. The journey to the first sanctuary took several days. The messenger led Anthony through dense forests, across rushing rivers and over steep mountain passes. Along the way, Anthony found himself reflecting on everything he had learned, about his family, about the Guardians, and about the responsibility he now carried. He thought of his mother, Helen, and the sacrifices she had made to protect this ancient knowledge. He thought of Eliza, and the strength she had shown in carrying on their mother's work. And he thought of the people of Cold Stone Village, who had trusted him to help guide them through this time of change. Finally, on the morning of the fourth day, they reached their destination. The first sanctuary was nestled in a hidden valley, surrounded by towering cliffs and dense vegetation. At the center of the valley stood a massive stone structure, its walls covered in carvings similar to those in the caves of Cold Stone Village. The air here was thick with an ancient energy, and Anthony could feel the weight of history pressing down on him. The messenger stopped at the edge of the valley and turned to Anthony, its eyes filled with a quiet intensity. It seemed to be waiting for him to take the next step. Anthony took a deep breath and walked toward the stone structure. As he approached, the carvings on the walls began to glow, just as they had in the heart of the Guardians. The massive doors of the sanctuary creaked open, revealing a dimly lit interior. Inside, Anthony found a group of people waiting for him. They were dressed in robes of different colors, each one adorned with symbols that matched those on his medallion. At the center of the group stood an elderly woman, her eyes sharp and knowing. "Welcome, Anthony Miller," she said, her voice echoing through the chamber. "We have been expecting you." Anthony stepped forward, his heart pounding. "You know who I am?" The woman smiled. "Of course. The messenger does not guide just anyone to our door. You are the son of Helen, the brother of Eliza. You carry the blood of the Millers, and with it, the responsibility of the Guardians." Anthony nodded, feeling the weight of her words. "I'm here to unite the sanctuaries, to ensure that the knowledge we protect is shared wisely and responsibly." The woman's smile widened. "Then you have come to the right place. We have much to discuss and little time to waste." As Anthony followed the woman and the other Guardians deeper into the sanctuary, he felt a sense of hope growing within him. The journey ahead would be long and difficult, but he knew he wasn't alone. The messenger had guided him this far, and it would continue to guide him as he worked to unite the 7 sacred places and fulfill the legacy of his family. The light from the heart of the Guardian still burned brightly in his mind, a reminder of the path he had chosen. And as he stepped into the heart of the first sanctuary, Anthony knew that he was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The wisdom of the ages was within his grasp, and he would do everything in his power to protect it and share it with the world. As Anthony stepped further into the sanctuary, the air grew thicker with the scent of aged wood and incense. The walls were lined with ancient tapestries, their threads woven with symbols that seemed to shift and shimmer in the dim light. The elderly woman, who introduced herself as Sister Miriam, led him to a circular chamber at the heart of the sanctuary. The room was dominated by a large stone table, its surface etched with the same intricate patterns he had seen in Cold Stone Village. Around the table stood 6 other figures, each wearing robes of different colors, their faces solemn but welcoming. "Anthony Miller," Sister Miriam said, her voice carrying the weight of authority. "You stand before the council of the first sanctuary. We are the keepers of the flame of Eternum, one of the 7 sacred treasures protected by the Guardians. Your arrival marks the beginning of a new chapter in our shared history." Anthony felt the weight of their gazes on him, but he stood tall, the medallion around his neck glowing faintly in response to the energy in the room. "I come as a representative of Cold Stone Village and the Millers," he said, his voice steady. "My family has long been connected to the Guardians, and I am here to fulfill our duty to unite the 7 sanctuaries and ensure the wisdom of the ages is protected and shared." One of the figures, a tall man with a beard streaked with gray, stepped forward. His robe was a deep blue and his eyes were sharp and piercing. "I am Brother Elias, keeper of the Tome of Whispers. Your journey here was foretold in our ancient texts, Anthony. The messenger's arrival with you confirms that the time has come to awaken the network of sanctuaries." Another figure, a woman with silver hair and a gentle demeanor, spoke next. Her robe was a soft green and her voice was like the rustling of leaves. "I am Sister Leona, guardian of the seed of eternity. The signs have been clear for some time now. The balance between the sanctuaries has been disrupted, and only by reuniting can we restore harmony. Anthony listened intently, his mind racing to absorb everything they were saying. "What must I do?" he asked. "How can I help bring the sanctuaries together?" Sister Miriam placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch warm and reassuring. "Your role is crucial, Anthony. The medallion you wear is not just a symbol, it is a key. Each sanctuary holds a piece of the puzzle, and only by gathering all 7 can we unlock the full potential of the ancient knowledge. The messenger will guide you to each sanctuary, but it is up to you to earn the trust of their guardians and convince them to join our cause." Brother Elias nodded in agreement. "The journey will not be easy. Each sanctuary has its own traditions and challenges. Some may resist the idea of unity, fearing that their secrets will be lost or misused. You must show them that our strength lies in our connection, not in our isolation." Anthony felt a surge of determination. "I understand. I'll do whatever it takes to bring the sanctuaries together, but I can't do this alone. I'll need your guidance and support." Sister Leona smiled warmly. "You are not alone, Anthony. We are all bound by the same purpose. The messenger chose you for a reason, and we will stand by you every step of the way." As the council members spoke, the light in the chamber grew brighter, the symbols on the walls and table glowing with a soft, golden light. Anthony felt a deep sense of connection to the people around him, as if the energy of the sanctuary was weaving them together. Sister Miriam stepped forward, holding out a small, intricately carved box. "This is the flame of Eternum," she said, opening the box to reveal a flickering flame that seemed to burn without fuel or heat. "It is one of the 7 sacred treasures, and it represents the eternal light of knowledge. Take it with you, Anthony, as a symbol of our trust and commitment to your mission." Anthony reached out and took the box, feeling a warm pulse of energy as his fingers touched the ancient wood. "Thank you," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. "I will protect it with my life." The messenger, which had been standing quietly at the edge of the chamber, neighed softly, its eyes fixed on Anthony. It was time to move on. Sister Miriam placed a hand on Anthony's arm. "Before you go, there is one more thing you must know. The journey ahead will test you in ways you cannot yet imagine. You will face challenges that will push you to your limits, and you will be forced to confront truths about yourself and your family. But remember, the messenger is always with you, and so are we." Anthony nodded, feeling the weight of her words settle in his chest. "I'm ready," he said, his voice firm. He said, "His. For my family, for the guardians, and for the future of the sanctuaries." With that, he turned and followed the messenger out of the chamber, the flame of Eternum safely tucked away in his pack. As he stepped back into the sunlight, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The journey to unite the sanctuaries had only just begun, but he knew that he was on the right path. The messenger led him down a narrow trail that wound through the valley and into the dense forest beyond. As they walked, Anthony's mind was filled with thoughts of the challenges ahead. He knew that each sanctuary would have its own trials, its own secrets, and its own guardians to convince. But he also knew that he had the strength and determination to see it through. Hours turned into days as they traveled, the landscape changing from dense forests to rolling hills, and finally to a vast, open plain. In the distance, Anthony could see the outline of another sanctuary, its stone walls rising like a beacon against the horizon. The messenger neighed softly, its eyes fixed on the sanctuary ahead. Anthony felt a surge of anticipation as they approached. This was the second sanctuary, the next step in his journey. As they drew closer, the doors of the sanctuary opened and a group of figures emerged, their robes billowing in the wind. At their head was a man with a stern expression and a staff carved with ancient runes. "Welcome, traveler," the man said, his voice deep and resonant. "I am Master Thorn, keeper of the Shard of Eternity. We have been expecting you." Anthony stepped forward, the flame of Eternum glowing faintly in his pack. "I am Anthony Miller, guardian of Coldstone Village. I come in peace, seeking to unite the sanctuaries and protect the wisdom of the ages." Master Thorn studied him for a moment, his gaze piercing. Then he nodded, a hint of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "The messenger has brought you to us for a reason. Come, Anthony Miller. Let us see if you are worthy of the task ahead." As Anthony followed Master Thorn into the sanctuary, he felt a sense of anticipation and resolve. The journey was far from over, But with each step, he was one step closer to fulfilling his destiny. The wisdom of the ages was within his grasp, and he would do everything in his power to protect it and share it with the world.